We sang Psalm 22. Now let's read it. We'll read the first half of the psalm. In the second half, Christ is, as it were, revived even on the cross with the hope of what his cross will accomplish in the salvation of a mighty multitude of people. But in the first part, he is crying out under the wrath of God. And we have in this psalm opened up for us the inner experience of the Lord Jesus on the cross in a way that's even deeper than is shown in the Gospels. So consider Psalm 22, and we'll read through verse 21. To the chief musician upon Ageleth Shahar, a psalm of David. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why art thou so far from helping me and from the words of my roaring? O my God, I cry in the daytime, but thou hearest not, and in the night season, and am not silent. But thou art holy, O thou that inhabitest the praises of Israel. Our fathers trusted in thee. They trusted, and thou didst deliver them. They cried unto thee, and were delivered. They trusted in thee, and were not confounded. But I am a worm, and no man, a reproach of men, and despised of the people. All they that see me laugh me to scorn. They shoot out the lip. They shake the head, saying, He trusted on the Lord that he would deliver him. Let him deliver him, seeing he delighted in him. But thou art he that took me out of the womb. Thou didst make me hope when I was upon my mother's breast. I was cast upon thee from the womb. Thou art my God from my mother's belly. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, for there is none to help. Many bulls have compassed me, strong bulls of Bashan have beset me round. They gaped upon me with their mouths as a ravening and a roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted in the midst of my bowels. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaveth to my jaws, and thou hast brought me into the dust of death. For dogs have compassed me. The assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. I may tell all my bones. They look and stare upon me. They part my garments among them and cast lots upon my vesture. But be not thou far from me, O Lord. O my strength, haste thee to help me. Deliver my soul from the sword, my darling from the power of the dog. Save me from the lion's mouth, for thou hast heard me from the horns of the unicorns. Presently singing Psalm 22 as a consecutive psalm. And to help you sing it with understanding, but also to give you a sermon especially applicable to you boys, I bring you this text. Because you, more than most, can say, in the words of Jesus here, that God has been your God from your mother's belly. Now, David is writing by the spirit of prophecy, but he's not just writing of himself. He, perhaps through his own experience, is lifting us above that to the experience of Christ as he hangs upon the cross. Christ, who quoted the first verse of this psalm on the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? But Christ did not just say this for himself. This psalm is given for us as a model for our own cross bearing, because every Christian is given by Jesus his own cross to bear. Now, this portion, verses 9 and 10, serves two purposes within the whole. The first is that as Christ is crying out under the burden of God's wrath upon him, he is sustaining his own soul by memories of mercy. He is remembering and comforting himself that God has been his God. But it also at the same time deepens the complaint. Because by contrast, the present distress is all the more distressing because God was so kind to him. He has an experience of mercy and now an experience of wrath. Now, this portion teaches something very important, and that is dependence upon God. And there are 3 points I want to make under the text. The first regards the time of this dependence, and it is in a word from the womb. So verse 9, thou art he that took me out of the womb, upon my mother's breasts. Verse 10, from the womb. Verse 10, from my mother's belly. 4 different ways to say the same thing to make it emphatic. From the time before you even took a breath on this life. From the time, Psalm 139, in which you were shapen in your mother's womb. From the time, as David says in Psalm 51, that thou wast a sinner. The time of dependence is that of the greatest physical dependence. There has never been a time when you were more needy than when you were in your mother's womb. Your mother did your breathing for you. She did your eating for you. And everything you needed was passed in a little cord into your body. And you depended on the flow of that cord, that umbilical cord, as we call it. You were totally and utterly dependent upon your mother. Unlike outside of the womb, you couldn't even cry to indicate your need. Utterly helpless. Thus, the time of dependence. But then, second, the necessity of that dependence. We've already shown that from the nature of the time that the baby is most dependent physically, but there's a spiritual dependence this is meant to illustrate. He says, thou art he that took me out of the womb. God, by his almighty power, brought me to birth. If that power had not been at work, I wouldn't have even made it out of the womb. He says, thou didst make me hope when I was upon my mother's breast. Any hope that I've ever had in thee is a work of thine, O God. I need thy help in order even to hope in thee. He says in verse 10, I was cast upon thee. I was thrown on thee as on a rock by a storm, so that I clung to thee as my only help. And if I hadn't had thee, I would have been lost. I was cast upon thee, and thou didst again thou art my God from my mother's belly. My God, an image of total dependence. The psalmist, in here Christ, according to his human nature, is aware of his complete and total dependence. There's a necessity of it. So we've seen the time of it and the necessity of it. The third is we see a posture of dependence. It's not just that it's necessary, but Christ and David recognize that necessity. And that recognition is marked by 2 important virtues. One is humility. Humility. Notice how he puts the focus on God. Thou art he that took me out of the womb. Thou didst make me host. I was cast upon thee. Thou art my God. He's complaining of his own distress, but his eyes are not ultimately on himself, but they're on the Lord. And he, expressing his dependence from the time when he was most dependent, is very low in himself, not thinking more highly of himself than he ought, but like a little baby again in the hands of God. That's humility. The second part of the posture, though, is hope. This is striking because Christ is speaking under the greatest possible distress. He's speaking under the sense of God's wrath poured into his soul. And yet he says that he hopes in God and that he's been doing this from the very beginning of his life. Thou art he that took me out of the womb. Thou didst make me hope when I was upon my mother's breast. This humility is low and it is sad, but it is not despairing. It's a humility that hopes in God and that calls him my God. Indeed, as verse 1 says, this God has forsaken him, but nonetheless he calls him my God. So this dependence is expressed in both humility and hope, namely a hope of mercy. And that brings us to our doctrine, that the true Christian recognizes his total dependence upon the mercy of God. His total dependence upon the mercy of God. Now, I want to unfold this doctrine a little more in two respects. The Christian recognizes his total dependence upon the mercy of God, first as a creature, and then second, as a sinner. So the true Christian first recognizes his total dependence upon the mercy of God as a creature. And this, in general, then in specific. In general, to be a creature means to be finite. The Creator only is infinite, unbound, independent. We, as all creatures, not just man, but everyone else, every other creature, is finite, is bound. And our finitude is especially marked by our body. The angels are finite too, but they are less bounded than we are because they are pure spirits. We have a spirit, our soul, but we also have a body. It's a house of clay, and sometimes spoken of as a prison of the soul. We don't say that to denigrate God's work of making our bodies, but to recognize that there is a dependence and finitude that's especially clear in our bodies. Consider Isaiah 6, a passage I go back to often. Remember that the angels there who cry, "Holy, holy, holy," these angels had never sinned, and they never will. And yet they cover their faces and their feet with their wings. They express a wholesome shame before God. Why is that? Well, again, it's not because they've sinned, but it's because they're creatures, because they're finite. God's holiness is so much more infinitely great than theirs is, and they can't barely stand being in his presence because of it. Now, if that's true for the angels or who are pure spirits, how much more ought it to be for us? So in chapter 4 of Job, Eliphaz says something very true, though with an evil end. It doesn't take away the truth of what he says. Job 4:18, behold, he put no trust in his servants, and his angels he charged with folly. An emphatic way to say that the wisdom of the angels cannot begin to approach to that of God. But then he says, verse 19, how much less in them that dwell in houses of clay? How much less should God trust in men whose foundation is in the dust, which are crushed before the moth? We share in the end of all creatures, even moths, in being crushed, and we have a body that can and often is be crushed. And in general, we're creatures, but in specific, and this applies to you boys, to recognize as a child that you among the creatures are particularly dependent upon God. You're not as dependent now as you were when you were in the womb. And you're not as dependent as you were when you were just a crying baby, as you both have, you all have brothers that right now can barely do anything for themselves. You can do a lot more for yourself, but nonetheless, you still are very dependent because you're young and weak. You're a literal child. But remember, Scripture also speaks of all men as figurative children of the Father in heaven and says that if you would come to God for salvation, you must come as a child. Mark 10:15. That is recognizing dependence upon God. And it is also true that God has been pleased among some, and perhaps among some of you, to call children to salvation, even from the womb. Isaiah appears to speak this way when he says, for 49:1, the Lord hath called me from the womb, from the bowels of my mother hath he made mention of my name. And that likely speaks of his regeneration from the womb. We say it's even more likely in the case of John the Baptist, remember, who leapt in his mother's womb when Christ in the womb of Mary came into the room. But we also read this of Paul, Galatians 1:15, that it pleased God who separated me from my mother's womb and called me by his grace. Paul was not converted until he was an adult. But nonetheless, he has the testimony of all Christians that even though he was lost and dead in his mother's womb and remained that way for a while, nonetheless, because he's converted now, he looks back and recognizes that God in a special way had sustained him there in the womb, and that God had planned to save him when he was an adult. God exercises a peculiar and special care over his elect, even in the time when they are not converted. And so, in specific, every Christian can look back to the time when he was most dependent and say, even then, Lord, thou wast my God. So as a creature. But then second, the true Christian recognizes his total dependence upon the mercy of God as a sinner. And this also in general and in specific. In general, by Adam. For Romans 5:12, for that all have sinned, that is, in Adam. In Adam, we all fell and have his guilt justly applied to us. But then Ephesians 2, verse 1, as you know, says we were dead in our trespasses and sins, not just Adam's, but ours. Indeed, it's the very time when David says that he was shapen in iniquity and in sin conceived in his mother's womb. It's from that time that God was his God. And there was never a time then, children, even from the very moment of your first existence in your mother's womb, that you were not a sinner in Adam and in yourself, liable to everlasting ruin. That should make you dependent upon God for mercy, because if he would not forgive you and save you, it would have been right for him to snuff you out in the womb and send you to hell, even as a little unborn child. But then in specific, by all the particular sins that since your mother's womb, as you've grown, have also grown, have come forth from your sinful nature. And those particular sins must be confessed particularly. No doubt, when the publican was in the temple, Luke 18, and he cried out, God be merciful to me, a sinner, he had in mind the particulars of his sin. And in Daniel 9, he confesses particular sins of his own people. You must express your dependence upon the mercy of God, not just in general as a sinner, but in specific as a sinner who's done this and this and this, recognizing that for every single one of those particular sins, you have deserved God's wrath. And if thou, O Lord, shouldst mark iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? So the true Christian recognizes his total dependence upon the mercy of God, both as a creature and as a sinner, and those both in general and in specific. When it comes to application, then, this calls for us to do three things. First, to confess your need. This is what it means to come as a child. Little children come to their parents and say, Dad, Mom, I need this. I'm hungry. Feed me. I'm thirsty. Give me water. I'm ignorant. Send me to school. I don't have any money. Please pay for all my needs. This is how we have to come to God. And you won't come to God until you come to him like that. as an utterly dependent child, as even an unborn child connected to God, as it were, by the umbilical cord of faith and drawing from Jesus Christ in heaven all that you need, every ounce of oxygen, of food, of nutrients. You need to depend on God as much as an unborn baby depends upon his mother. Recognize that even if you are a converted Christian, you still depend completely upon God's mercy, because your remaining sin proves to you what Paul experienced and cried out in Romans 7:24, "O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me?" Even as an experienced Christian, despairing of any hope in his own self and casting himself totally upon the mercy of God. That's what you must do. Confess your need for that mercy. Second, give thanks for this mercy. Every creature should be able to give thanks and say, in some sense, thou hast been my God from my mother's belly, because here he is, alive. He made it out of the womb, and that's why he can speak. And that's true for you, but all the more if you boys have a testimony of God's spiritual faithfulness to you, and you can testify that he has given you his word and spirit. He's baptized you, and he, even if he has, giving you true regeneration and conversion, whereby you call on the name of the Lord and are saved. If he has done that to you, and you can say in the fullness of its senses, thou art my God from my mother's belly, then you ought to give God thanks. You ought to use Psalm 136 and say, his mercy endureth forever. And it ought to be, as in that psalm, on repeat all of your life. This is a mark of that dependence, is thankfulness. Recognizing you hadn't had that mercy, you'd be lost, but you have it. And so you're continually delighted in the God who's shown you this mercy that you needed. So confess need. Second, give thanks. Third, seek this mercy. Seek mercy. If you need it, get it. You need to come to Christ, who is able to give you all your needs. I don't speak to unborn children. We can't exhort them to come to God and make him their God. They don't have any natural ability to do so. But here you are, thinking, speaking, learning, able to come. And so come. Use the relative independence you have to choose freely now to be dependent upon God's mercy. You were cast from the womb upon God, and now your duty is to cast yourself upon God, making him your chief end and making Christ your only mediator. Psalm 71 speaks of an old man looking back and saying, from my youth, thou hast been my God. This then is what you must say. You are in your youth now. Make God your God. Depend upon his mercy in the Lord Jesus Christ. Let's stand and pray.